Hey everybody, welcome to the GMG review. Today we are taking a look at Warhammer. All the Warhammers, every Warhammer. We're taking a look at Warhammer The Old World, and I wanted to do something a little bit different because there's a million Warhammer The Old World things going up today, and a whole bunch of them are from me because I needed to break this into bite-sized chunks. How do you release a game this big all at once? Well, you don't. You release it in stages, and that's what's happening today, and that's what I'm doing. Is to eat an elephant, I'm gonna do it one bite at a time. So this video is kind of a gateway video to bring you guys into what I'm putting out today, and so that you guys can hopefully get what you're looking for information-wise about the old world. So this is going to be more of a top-down, what is this, what are the ingredients, the DNA, more for seasoned Warhammer players probably than beginners, because Games Workshop themselves has done everything beginner-wise already for this property leading up to this release. So my goal by making these videos is if you've already played Warhammer or you have some history with Warhammer, to give you something to dig into, to show you the design stuff and to formulate and to share my opinion about how this is going and what this is and what this looks like it's going to be in the future. And to do that, we're going to do kind of some storytelling. What's Warhammer? Warhammer is a rank and flank miniature game. Of course, started here, and I've played and interacted with all of these. This is the first edition. It's actually pretty similar to what you're going to see here today, in that it is separated in a few books. We've got the Magic book, the Tabletop Battles book, which is the core rules, the characters, and then later on, to give you the rest of it in a second book, you had this, Ravening Hordes and Forces of Fantasy. These were the rules that gave you the army lists themselves, and showed you how to play a mission and what kind of forces you might play with, which was the unit entries themselves. Gnomes, halflings, sea elves, high elves, all that great stuff. And this release is kind of mimicking that, but it has less in common, and of course, obviously the nostalgia picks of doing the names and titles with these types of games than it does with this, weirdly enough, and with this, weirdly enough. So less the old, and more a Middle Hammer redo. This book right here and these books right here are probably where you're going to find the ingredients that made up these books down here. And I wanted to show all of this to you guys to give you some context, because the design team behind the old world is the design team behind the Middle Earth strategy battle game. And you can see a whole lot of that in the design of these books. In the rule book itself, the way the rules have been changed and laid out, as well as in the core mechanics of the game. And that's kind of populated my notes for this whole thing. In the box set, obviously, for the two armies, there is a Bretonnian box and there is a Tomb Kings box. The complete ranges of those are apparently going on order today, and that's it. If you've got old Warhammer models, then you can play with the rest of the armies in here, but the key two releases that will be available from Games Workshop at pre-order today are just going to be the Tomb Kings and the Bretonnians, with some nice new models and some classic old models. I spent so much time building both, but they're not really what I'm excited for in the old world. So I'm taking my time and getting some bases in the right size, and I'm gonna old hammer it up with my old hammer stuff and my middle hammer stuff and all my favorite Warhammer miniatures. And that's kind of what this release is. Because they're putting out 9 army lists, the Armies of Legend lists for like the older Warhammer players who have those armies already, although there'll be a lot of either re-regiment training or rebasing to do. And then 2 armies to start it with, which is of course the Tomb Kings and the Bretonnians. You've got a big job ahead, like that had to be done to kind of make all of this fit. And to do that, they put together a massive rule book, and we're going to get to these books in separate videos. We're going to focus on this right here for the remainder of this conversation. So let's get these gone and talk about the Fantasy Battles in the World of Legend rulebook. This, as you can tell, has been very much designed by the same people that made this, the Middle Earth Strategy Battle Game Rules Manual, and for good reason. They are some of the I guess, original design studio team minds left at Games Workshop. They are, of course, I'm unable to find them because their names are not in here. But this rulebook was made by the Forge World studio and the same team that brought you these books. And you can tell that in the layout. Giving you a top-down overview of it in general. It is a almost 400-page, 350-page book, which you can tell has gone back a ways. Look at the terrain in this photography. There is a very old-school Warhammer look to everything in here, and a lot of time and attention has been done to capture the sort of like bygone age of Warhammer in this book, right down to the art. The art is reusing some original assets, such as this wonderful classic skeleton picture here, lots of these old Alex Boyd and sort of like Middle Hammer art pieces, and some of the older stuff too, but even done in a sepia tone as opposed to in color. So there are a few color shots in here, but a lot of it has been muted down and re-rendered in almost like a kind of ghostly, transparent way to give it like a little more gravitas. This feels like a historical book, and the game is being presented in a historical way. And that leads me to phase one. So phase one, we're gonna talk about the world. And the world has very specifically been set back in time slightly, about 100 years after the departure of Sigmar. He, of course, unifies the Unbrogen tribes, the humans, allies with the dwarves, defeats the orcs at Blackfire Pass. If you know anything about Warhammer lore, that's kind of a big deal. And then rules for 80 years over the Empire, at which point he goes into the West. He Frodo's away to keep with the Lord of the Rings references and disappears into the West. And that is roughly when we're setting this time period. So there's an important thing from Games Workshop's point of view. They can get rid of all the special characters. They can get rid of all the expectations of like those people being around. Introduce new ones, which when we talk about the Tomb Kings and the Bretonnian army lists, which you'll be able to click on later on because I'm doing an army list feature for all the armies. You'll see what I mean by that. Unless they're completely immortal or very, very old, they don't show up. There's no special characters. You're not going to see any Karl Franzes. They don't have to worry about those miniatures. They don't have to worry about this story in the timeline. And the front half of this book, the first 100 pages, is dedicated to that. You don't get to the rules until page 91. So they do a lot to give you the background for the 9 featured armies. And it also gives them a reason to kind of not focus on all of them. Because remember, there's almost 20 armies at the end of 8th edition. Lots of sub-armies and sub-factions as well, but we completely don't deal with anything outside the old world. So there's no worrying about the Lustrians, there's no worrying about the Dark Elves. They're having their own little time, basically. They're all not here. And for the 5 good armies, we have the Wood Elves and High Elves from the Elves, the Dwarves themselves, and then 2 human armies, which is the Bretonnians and the Empire. From the evil army point of view, the Beastmen and Chaos make up part of it, and then Tomb Kings represent the undead, and the Orcs and Goblins are all unified as the Orcs and Goblins, and those are your 4 bad guy armies. We do not have a complete range relaunch here, and in fact, I think they're not really relaunching ranges that either still sort of kind of super exist in Warhammer, and the focus seems to be primarily on anything whose model kits are available kind of still to produce, so like the Tomb Kings model kits are available to produce, but weren't being sold anymore in Age of Sigmar. So that's why I think the Cities of Sigmar thing allowed for I guess the rest of that range to get repackaged. So things like the state troops and stuff like that will be available in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, which is the Warhammer the Old World, but we don't have to worry about it being available in the other game, and it won't sort of like cross-platform, if you will. Nothing seems to really be cross-platform. Even Black Orcs, who are in Warhammer the Old World, which is the Warhammer Fantasy. I'm going to keep saying Warhammer Fantasy Battle. I'm not going to be able to help myself. Even the Old World equivalent have got new miniatures now, so they don't even exist. They don't cross-platform into the old. I think the only ones I can think of is Spider Riders. Maybe the Spider stuff will still cross-platform, and the Night Goblins will cross-platform. That's about it. So let's talk about the game. And so that's my background part. And what it means is, until those 9 armies get released, weird things are not. And it's funny because the entire Skaven range is a good example of this. I guess to talk about what I'm, or to put a point on what I'm saying, the entire Skaven range exists as a Skaven army book in AOS. So they're not repackaging it for this game, which I found strange because they are the most compliant to just being rebased into this game, and their army list doesn't exist here, which they were believed to not exist in the Empire for years and years. Kind of makes sense, but they could have very easily been the most compatible 5th army for the bad guy faction, and they're just not in this game, which I found interesting. So the rules themselves. I would say that the closest thing you could have to describing what this rule set looks like is if you took the Middle Earth strategy battle game and had it have a baby with 6th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle. That is the closest equivalent to what we have here. It actually is a toned down version of a combination of those two game systems and has far less in common with 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle. So if anything, this game is much more middle hammer and low fantasy than the kind of like celebration that 8th edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle was of Warhammer, where it wound the game down and let everybody play their power fantasy out. The power scale of this game is much lower. I made lots of legal pad notes for us to talk about. And that's where we're gonna go now, going through the rules. I'm not gonna do like a page by page because I don't want to, because that's way too much for a video of this nature. This is greatest hits of like what's changed and what's different. So first things first, we're gonna go through the different phases. The strategy phase has replaced completely, and this is more of an import from the current editions of Warhammer, so from like Age of Sigmar and Warhammer 40k, a strategy phase. It's kind of like a command phase. There are no strategy command points or anything like that to deal with. There's no currency that you can spend throughout the game. This is just the phase where it's replaced the magic phase in so much as if a magic spell doesn't make sense to exist in a subsequent phase, and that's where we get to our, this is magic like in Lord of the Rings. It now exists here. Your wizards have magic levels. Their spells are generated pretty much the same way as they were in previous editions of Fantasy. You roll a d6 on the lore of magic that they know. You can always drop, you reroll any doubles, and you always drop your spells for the signature spell if you want. It's a very common magic generation system. You can cast all your spells each turn. So right now there's no wizards who know every spell from a spell lore, because like I said, all of that like kind of power fantasy stuff is out of this game. And if you are level 1 or 2, you're like considered like a low mage. If you're level 3 or 4, you're considered a high level mage, and that gives you certain bonuses to your casting and dispelling. Dispellings become more dangerous, and you also get what's called a fated dispel. So anytime someone casts a spell, you can attempt to dispel it if someone's in range. 18 inch for a low level wizard, 24 for a high level wizard. This is another difference. It used to just be 30 inches, I think, flat, or maybe 24 inches flat. But regardless, your dispel roll, you add your level to, and if you double ones, you are outmastered, and you have to make a roll on the miscast table, which never happened before. And if you double 6, you unbind the spell and it's gone. You have what's called a fated dispel once per turn. It has no range, but anybody can use it to try and just naturally roll 2d6 and dispel a spell, which means you can always get a unbinding, but if you roll double ones, there's no wizard to target with the unrivaled magic. And then the remaining spells are cast basically in the appropriate phase. So for the stuff that happens in the strategy phase, it's going to be anything that would augment or hex a unit, or like anything that doesn't have a target. So anything that persists throughout the round and then remains in play, typically those things will happen during that phase. I think it's a magical vortex, a magic missile, happens in the shooting phase. I think it's a conveyance spell or something that would move a unit around, will happen in the movement phase. I think it's a like touch attack kind of spell, will happen in the combat phase. That's it. And each of the spells will tell you when it takes place. So there's no need for a magic phase. They happen as appropriate. And if your opponent, if you can't cast them, then you just can't cast them. They don't happen without needing to happen. It's a nice clean way of using the magic system, and it's very much reminiscent of the rules for the Middle Earth strategy battle game, where spells happen in the appropriate phase, or they happen in the shooting phase if they don't have a phase to happen in. Same design team, makes sense. It's a lot cleaner. You don't have to worry about magic, wins of magic, or pools of magic dice, or any of that stuff. It's much more like 6th edition, where although 6th edition did have power dice, and you spent your power pool to cast spells, this one's just roll higher than the casting value of the spell and add your wizard level, so you don't have to worry about dice anymore. Kind of adding, your more powerful wizards can get off the more powerful spells, and the lower level wizards can roll naturally and try and cast them. And you're not buying and generating power dice to get more spells off over the course of a turn. You just get to cast what you get to cast. Then the movement phase, was anything else I made notes on? Dispelling's more dangerous. One fated dispel, yeah, it's kind of it. 40k kind of command phase. You also rally your fleeing troops in that phase if possible. Then you get your classic movement phase. This is the most classic type of movement phase. The biggest difference is charging is much shorter range. You charge 2d6, discard the lowest now. Hindered charges would be 2 dice, discard the highest instead. And you add that to your base movement value. So no more 2d6 charges and no more not adding your movement. You add your base movement to the charge roll again. So it's kind of a blend between the random charge range of 8th edition fantasy and the double your move charge range of 6th edition. Like I said, it's more Middle Hammer, with there still being some random. You're not guessing a range because pre-measuring is allowed in this, like you would in 6th edition fantasy, where you'd have to like eyeball, is that 8 inches or not to double my movement and charge in. In this case, you're getting a random move added to your base movement stat. Other than that, the movement's pretty much the same. Wheeling's pretty much the same. One of the quality of life improvements that I like now, although it might catch some people off guard, is that you can go off the table in this edition of fantasy, as long as you end your move on the table. So you can't use the flanks of the table to protect you from flank charges by like angling your units just so. If a unit can complete its charge and fit where it needs to go, it can charge and clip off the table while it's doing things. So the rule is called, like, I think it bounds of the earth or ends of the earth. Like there's no end of the earth sort of like problem where you can't exist off the table for 3 seconds. The only time if you touch the table you're in trouble is if you're fleeing and then you're removed, like in any other edition of fantasy. So yeah, that's really it. The importance is still on charging. The morale system we'll get to at the end when the combat phase, but movement phase is pretty much the same. Difficult terrain slightly a bit less restrictive. If you go through difficult terrain, it's -1 to your movement as opposed to having your move. But if you touch it at any point during the turn, it's -1 to your movement stat, not your doubled movement. So even if you march through it, then you can't do it. So like I said, yeah, strategy phase, start of turn, command phase. Some characters have special rules that let them do commands and inspire commands. They can do it at that time, or magic items can do it. Happens then. Conjuration, which is when you augment and hex units. And enchant things, rally fleeing troops. We already talked about that. Movement phase, yeah, so charge moves. And like I said, the order is pretty standard. Declare charges and charge reactions, charge moves, compulsory moves, remaining moves. Every edition of fantasy after 5th, I think, had roughly that same thing, but it was pioneered, I think, in those terms in this one, in 6th edition fantasy. Then we're into the shooting phase. All right, so the shooting phase is, again, pretty similar to the way it's always been. Choose a unit, declare a target, roll to hit, roll to wound, make armor saves, remove casualties, and make panic tests. I think the biggest thing that's comforting to me in this is we use the old wound table. And there is still a rolls of 6 or higher. If your ballistic skill is higher than 6, you get 2s and 6s, 2s and 5s, 2s and 4s, 2s and 3s, 2s and 2s for missing. And then needing to roll higher than 6 as well. I think you get that. No, the 7's to hit. There we go. Yeah, 6s and 4s. If you need a 7 at 6, it's 6s and 4s. If you need an 8 at 6s and 5s. And if you need a 10, it's impossible. Yeah, wounds, the wound chart's very comforting. It's the old school wound chart. So once you're tied, it doesn't use the new 40K style of wound charts. It's once you're tied, it's a 4, 1 higher is a 3, 2 higher is a 2, double +1, you can't wound anymore. And you can never go better than 2+ to wound. You can never have better than 2+ save. A natural one's always a fail to save, which I think is interesting. When you determine your armor value, you stack all the armor together, and then armor piercing can net that out. And then you remove casualties and make panic tests. No need for stacks, you only make 1 panic test per turn, even if you're already fleeing or not fleeing. And then oddball stuff like magical missiles and vortexes, they are cast during the shooting phase, just like as if you were going to shoot with a unit. So just like you would select a unit to fire, like here's my unit of bowman, here's my wizard, you select the wizard to cast their magical spell, just like that. And they need the same something's in their arc and something's in line of fire. Shooting from hills, you get additional rank bonuses. This is all pretty similar volley fire stuff. And then combat phase, choosing to fight in combat. Like I said, you've got pretty much a 6th edition version of fighting in combat here. Now, what's important about me noting that it's more like this than like 8th edition, which is the previous edition to this one. Step up is gone. Initiative becomes king. There's no more always strike first. What you get instead from charging is you get initiative bonus. For every inch you charge during a charge, you get +1 to your initiative to a maximum of +3. If you are flanking or rear charging, get a maximum raise to +4, which is a big difference. It adds your initiative with maneuvering. It means things like initiative 2 orcs and dwarves can be initiative 5 on the charge when they're charging, 6 if they charge into the flank, And like I said, because the stats are less heroically sort of like high on everything in the game, that becomes way more relevant. You have orcs actually able to strike first, or dwarves able to strike first. Things like mummies even able to strike first against certain units on the charge. But because there's no more step up, that means if you die in a higher initiative band and you're in the fighting rank or the supporting rank, you don't get to fight this turn. You can actually lose enough guys that you do not get to fight back because things are simply faster than you. It solves the problem of the crazy escalating strike first abilities and strike last abilities that actually started in this edition, because always strike last was a weapon trait for heavy weapons, like great weapons and stuff like that, and then blew out with like always strike first. If you were always strike first in a higher initiative, you rerolled all your hit dice, or all your it just got crazier and crazier into 8th edition with like units becoming super powered. In fact, the toning down goes all the way to things like toughness, where I looked through to try and find the toughest model I could, and even a Chaos Lord and a Dragon is only toughness 6. So no toughness 7 super monsters in this game, and generally speaking, everyone's able to hurt everyone else, and there isn't like just an immune to damage kind of model. So let's quickly break down the combat phase, what's different, what's new. It's going to be, until we get to the break test, it's going to be pretty familiar to veteran Warhammer players, this process. Choosing to fight a combat, it could involve multiple units fighting a single unit, or multiple units fighting multiple units. There'll be a winning and losing side. Calculate the combat result. I could do this in my sleep still. You're going to add your rank bonus. You're going to add standards and battle standards if you have one, magic standards and oddball stuff if you have those, and then things like unit strength and outnumbering on top of that. Then the break test. So the break test is where stuff starts to get weird, and we'll talk about it in a second. And then follow up and pursuit, which has also changed slightly because there's new modes. There isn't just in combat and running away, or draw where nothing changes. There's going to be shades of gray. You can also just be pushed back or give ground. So an interesting sort of like dynamic to the movement during combats. So let's jump in, starting with choosing and fighting. Choosing to fight, and it's going to go starting to ending initiative. Like I said, the no step up is going to mean that casualties count for quite a bit. There is no such thing, although there are rules called always strike first and always strike last. They don't actually trump each other the way that they did in previous editions. What they do now is before modifiers are applied, they set your initiative to 10 or 1, which means that even if you have great weapons with the always strike last rule, you become initiative 1, but if you're charging in the flank, you could still be initiative 5 on the charge, given that you're going to get potentially a plus 40 your initiative when you strike. Not having them be absolutes and always having an initiative number that everyone's going to strike at just makes the game cleaner. and also means that, again, they're not superpowers. They just mean that you're going to strike in a certain initiative order, depending upon which weapon you strike with. So, for instance, great weapons for dwarves, not really a huge penalty, but great weapons on elves, they could be worse. Just in previous editions, if you have both the rules, always strike first and always strike last, they cancel each other out. Then we got rolling to hits. Again, the to hit chart, like I said, I think is one of my favorite, well, sorry, the wound chart is one of my most comforting and favorite things. The hit chart also is in this case. In these current editions of like Age of Sigmar and Warhammer 40,000, one of the things that got lost is the defensive bonus of having a high weapon skill. And I love that that's back here. When you compare weapon skills to determine in your initiative step your roll to hit, it means that a goblin who's weapon skill 2, for instance, can't strike a weapon skill 7 elf as easily, and it isn't fixed to hit. So he's going to hit on a 5 because that guy's just a better fighter, and weapon skill becomes both a offensive and defensive statistic, which I think is great. So you're going to compare, like I said, down the middle you're tied, and then better or worse. If you become worse by double +1, you hit on 5s, all the way up to, I think the maximum cap out is 5, and all the way down to 2s if your weapon skill is more than 2 better than someone else's. So the always hit on 1s and natural rolls of 6 will always hit as well, making it that you've got a superior natural 6 and a always sort of fumble on a 1. Same goes for wounds and armor saves, it's the same as with shooting. And like I said, I could not find any toughness 7 things so far in the rules in this game, even if you start mounting things on dragons. And that is a small change. Monsters do not have a separate stat line. They have condensed the monster into a wound and toughness bonus to the rider, and they fight as one model. Which again, it's just kind of easier and cleaner than having them have separate statistics and having the dismounted rider and all that stuff. It was fun from like a granular point of view, but this edition of the game seems to focus on playability versus granularity. Armor saves. If the armor value roll is equal to or higher than the armor, and of course you've got the modifiers, of course, stacking on top of that. Natural rolls of 1 always fail regardless of other modifiers. When you determine your armor value, it's based on what you've got. It's just like in the shooting section. I love this old skeleton painting. I think that's an Adrian Smith, which I think is very cool. And then removing casualties. So like I said, this is where the step up has gone away, like in 8th edition, and you're always going to have casualties come off the rank. So there's the fighting rank, the rank in combat. Then there is the supporting rank. If you have weapons that can make supporting attacks like spears or pikes or halberds, not halberds actually, just spears or pikes, then they are able to fight over top of their friends. So first, if you've taken any casualties in a higher initiative band before you get to strike, you reduce the fighting ranks total by that many casualties, and that's why you always put casualties one side. And then from the supporting rank as well, if you're able to make supporting attacks. That means that not everyone's going to get to fight, and sometimes the unit just gets pulverized on the charge with a higher initiative and doesn't get to strike back. And then, yeah, calculating combat results, so comforting. Unsaved wounds, 1 point each. Rank bonus, plus 1 point per rank. Now, rank bonuses have changed slightly based on your width. You get a maximum rank bonus that goes higher the wider you are, depending on your unit type. And certain units like cavalry, they only ever get 2 ranks of bonus, or a +2. They can't cap out a +3. You can't take giant lance formations and get lots and lots of rank bonuses. Standards and battle standards, flank and rear attacks, high ground, and overkill of up to +5 if you're in a challenge. And then other bonuses as applicable, like magic standards and stuff like that. Once you've totaled all this up per side, so each side in the combat, no matter how many units are involved, will add up their total. You're going to make a break check. And that is, sorry, if you're tied, nothing happens, everybody stays in combat and keeps fighting. But if one side is higher, the other side has to make a break test. Now, in past editions of Warhammer, and this immediately felt weird to me, you are going to reduce your leadership stat by the amount you lost by, and then try and roll equal to or under your leadership. In this edition, it's a little more complicated. First, you roll the 2d6 roll. If the unmodified roll is higher than your leadership stat, you flee. No matter what, you just get driven off. You don't have to worry about the total of the combat result or anything like that. If it's higher, you're just gone. If the natural result roll is equal to or lower than your leadership, but the modified result, because you add to the dice roll the amount you lost by, then you fall back in good order. So the idea, sorry, if the natural roll is higher, yeah, you flee. If the natural roll is under your leadership, but modified is higher than your leadership, you fall back in good order, which means you fall back 2d6 and pick the lowest. Then you which is a normal flee move, so you're gonna add your movement to it as well. And you immediately rally at the end of it, which means someone could pursue into you and cause a new charge. But basically, you're gonna move backwards slightly less than if you just completely fled. And you're gonna be rallied at the end of it, meaning they can't pursue into you and just destroy you immediately. It's just gonna count as a new charge. And then finally, if the modified result of the dice roll is less than your leadership, or if you roll a natural double 1, the unit gives ground. That means it gets pushed back 2 inches, and the opponent can follow up to 2 inches to get into combat with it. This can get weird, like you can see here in this diagram. If there's 2 units like in combat, instead of being pushed back or giving ground this way, it'll give ground diagonally, and then both units have the opportunity to close back in. So yeah, an interesting sort of like an interesting thing in that you don't. There's shades of losing combat now, and it's the hardest thing to do is gonna wrap my mind around the modification to the leadership. Because you could lose like by a bajillion, it just means you're always gonna, as long as the 2d6 roll is equal to or under your leadership, you're always going to fall back in good order. And that means leadership stats aren't gonna be crazy, and they're actually gonna be more relevant because you're not being punished as much. And unless the dice roll is over your leadership naturally, you're never going to be destroyed in a combat. So again, a little like the pushback stuff, just from losing, it feels like a little bit of the pushback mechanic in Lord of the Rings, although you follow up in this one, you never end out a combat unless you choose to as the attacker or the winner. And then you have to stay 1 inch apart if you're not pushing back into combat. Follow-up and pursuits are pretty much the same. When you make a pursuit move, you have to declare before the flee distance is rolled. And if you come into contact with a fleeing unit that has fled, not that it's fled in good order, because they rally automatically at the end of their flee move, then you destroy them. If you pursue into them and they've fallen back in good order, then you just count as charging again during the following turn. And then you can also pursue into fresh enemies, potentially as well, as things flee through their friends. And there is penalties for fleeing through enemy troops, and you can cause panic tests by fleeing through your own models. All right, psychology, panic tests. This is all pretty much. It's interesting how psychology is its own section now. It always was its own section actually in previous editions. It's pretty much exactly the same. There's panic, although they don't lump hatred, fear, and terror in here, which I think is interesting. It's just panic tests in the psychology section now. All of the other parts, so frenzy, hatred, fear, terror, they're just universal special rules. So it felt weird. I don't know, just moving them out of there. It doesn't change anything really mechanically. They all work almost identically. It's just weird that they're not in here anymore. So yeah, panic from fleeing through. Nearby friends flee from combat, you make a panic test still. Nearby friends destroyed, you make a panic test still. Heavy casualties from taking damage. And then in addition, a unit's not required to make a panic test if it's making a charge move, it's engaged in combat, or it is already fleeing and has yet to rally. That's it, one page. Just panic tests in psychology. It feels weird. And that's the combat phase. And so that's really the core mechanical stuff that is new and different. It's Warhammer. It's hard for me to review this giant book having played Warhammer for 30 years. You know, it's been around for 40 years. I played it for 30. I played it through almost every edition since 5th or 4th. And the game is not that different. It's more a blend of its greatest hits. So let's talk about some of the other stuff in this book. At the end, in army construction, because that's really the last thing that's changed. We've gone away from the slots and into the percentages for army construction. This is a pretty familiar thing for older editions of the game, but you're not required to have like a certain amount of core choices. There will be some unit types that have like a 1+. So for instance, the Bretonnian army list, you have a 1+ Knights of the Realm. You have to take for the Tomb Kings, it's 1+ Hierophant and Tomb King or Prince, because you have to have a leader, and you have to have someone to like raise the army. And that's really it. Apart from that, units will have their own sort of like bespoke percentages, but the percentages are generally mostly the same for most armies. Half your army can be spent on, or half your stuff can be spent on characters or points. Cores at least 25, specials up to 50, rares up to 25, mercenaries up to 20. This is pretty common. And then allies are in here now. Up to 25% can be spent on an allied contingent. If you do decide to take allies, you have to have a character model to be their general, because they're like a sub-army inside your army. And other than that, you can take whatever you like. They will have a table. If they're trusted allies, then they basically count as units in your army, with a few exceptions, like the general characters can't join the units, and generals can't, but they can't benefit from like leadership abilities and stuff like that. But you could also have uneasy allies. They get the levy special rule for all the main army units, and then they can't be considered friendly by wizards. And then suspicious, if you flee through suspicious troops, then you have to make dangerous tests because they are potentially going to stab you in the back. And there's also mercenaries. Some armies have mercenary sections. Hiring mercenaries does not come without risk. Mercenaries can sometimes prove unwilling to endanger themselves. To represent this, roll a d6 for each mercenary unit prior to deployment. On a 2+, they've held up their side of the bargain and show up willing to fight. On a 1, you have to roll in the misbehaving mercenaries table. So like they might have like problems. They might show up late. General apathy for whatever reason. They don't seem to care. They suffer -1 modifier to their leadership test for the duration of the battle. Just stuff like that. They're not great. And then we have all of our core rules for regimental units and detachments. So for Empire armies, this is going to be pretty familiar. Basically taking sub-detachments for your regiments. If you have that special rule where you're allowed to do that, it's in the main army book. So they don't have to reprint this stuff in like an Empire supplement. The rules for detachments, doing supporting fire, counter-charging, stuff like that, supporting charges, they're all in this main rule book. So the standard table size is going to be 6x4 still, although they do give playing on more modern table size sort of like guidelines as well, up to 1,000 points on a 30x44. I think we're going to play some of those games when we do our Escalation League for this game. I'm actually excited to play on a smaller table and play some more intimate games of Warhammer. And then between 1,000 and 3,000 on a 44x60. I have 6x4 Warhammer tables, so I'm not really worried about playing on the smaller size. But I'm interested to see how the game plays at like 1,500 points on a slightly smaller board. Because the armies at certain game sizes for Warhammer can kind of get lost on a bigger table. It's going to be neat to see what happens when we change the table size a little bit. There are 6 core missions in here as well. Open battle, breakpoint, flank attack, meeting engagement, mountain pass, and command and control. These are all going to sound pretty familiar. Battle of the Pass, you know, pitch battle, open battle. It's basically the same thing, but they all get cool histories and names, like the Plain of Languille, the Doom of Odo Todmire III, the Battle of Pine Crags, the Drakwald Forest Incident, the Battle of Jizero Gap, and the Lonely Tower. And then you've got your sort of like breakdown of the story that would, you know, be ideal for these, like Battle of the Pass. It's Battle of the Mountain Pass. These are classic Warhammer scenarios. And then, yeah, King of the Hill, the Tower, just classic too. And then we have a huge selection of narrative rules as well for your narrative motives. Some sort of like more modern, like this, more modern Surprise Attack, Dark Monolith. These are just sort of like a last stand, asymmetrical missions. You get 3 of them for the narrative campaigns, and then you mix in the standard ones as well, which I thought was cool. So not quite this book, where we also got skirmish, siege, and campaigns in one book, but you know, we live in a different age. Having Rick and Thomas write this entire book, you know, and also having terrain and stuff like that. Yeah, Warhammer Skirmish. This was the GOAT right here, I think. Not necessarily the best rule set, but definitely GOAT as far as rule books. And then last but not least, we've got our magic lores. Now, surprisingly, there are not 8 winds of magic in this. There are magic lores that are all thematic. So battle magic is the core one, demonology is the chaos one, dark magic is like the bad guy general one, elementalism is your one for your sort of like your wood elves, life magic basically, high magic for your other elves, illusion as well for the wood elves, necromancy, and then Wa magic for the orcs. So they're kind of generally in here as a like core sort of like list. And I'm going to go through each of those when I go through the army lists for the appropriate armies that have them. So don't worry about getting all that here. We have a extensive magic list for magic items because you get a couple of additional magic items with each army list, but for the most part, your magic items are going to be in here. Most characters get their own sort of like budget for whether or not they can buy magic items at different levels, depending upon how high a level character it is. And there's some classics in here: Ogre Blade, Swords of Might, Biting Blades. You get all the greatest hits, and they work pretty much the same. Armor of Destiny gives you a 4+ ward, but you're spending your whole budget when you get something like that. Wizarding Hats to become a level 1 mage, Potions of Speed, and then arcane items like a feedback scroll, and it is Spell Scroll, baby! Classic. It's not automatic though. There's no automatic power for casting and dispelling in this one. You gotta roll still, you just get bonuses. And then a quick ref. So, how do I feel about this so far? Oh man. Well, obviously this is new. I haven't played it a ton, although I guess my first instinct of what to say is this feels very familiar. It feels like coming back to things that I like quite a bit. A design team that I like the rules for quite a bit, and inspirations, and like, look at this, the sepia tone, right? The black and white art. It feels like this feels like a late 90s, early 2000s Warhammer product. And I understand intrinsically that I'm the person they're aiming that at, right? This is nostalgia in a book. It is bottling a time and place of playing Warhammer, giving it a few updated models, bring back some of their classic range of miniatures that they, you know, haven't been selling for a while, but they still have the molds for, and setting it in a period where they kind of have a blank check to write their own story and tell the tale of the old world without having all the hang-ups of how it ended, or even like the previous 30 years editions of the game with all the special characters. Like, you don't have to have a Karl Franz, you don't have to have a, you know, a Jules Le Jongleur come back for the Bretonnians, or a Hugo Le Petit. And so I'm okay with it. I understand what it's trying to do. I think the best thing about this so far is it doesn't seem like it's going to drown in releases. And when we talk about the army books and the additional products that go with this, such as the Forces of Fantasy, or this guy right here, the Kingdom of Bretonnian Arcane Journal and the Bretonnian Army book, which I'm going to compare and show you the difference between what these two things are. You don't need this to play. If they do 1 million additional releases for this game, you're not going to have to buy all of them the way you did with old Warhammer, where your army book was everything. If you just play out of these two books, this is a complete game, and it feels complete. It doesn't feel like it's missing anything. It doesn't feel like there's any content that's locked behind a paywall. It feels like you had old Warhammer players come together and try and make like a definitive collection of what a certain period of playing Warhammer felt like. So I actually don't think that this is being written for like the 8th edition Warhammer player. And I think that's probably a good thing, because the people who are going to be attracted to this probably will just make new movement trays for their old armies and try it out. And that's going to be completely fine. If you just grab a copy of the army book, or the Army's Forces book for your army, and the rule book, when they become available separately, you should be good to go. And that, the feeling like it's being done almost not like a one-shot, but almost like, hey, here it is all at once. You can all go play if you want. We're going to give you a free army list for all the armies we didn't include in here for whatever range reasons, or, you know, background reasons that we don't care about because we're just the consumer. Yeah, it feels like it's been done by older period Warhammer players for older period Warhammer players. It's not chasing some kind of meta. I don't feel like it's going to be I really hope it's not a game people try and like make huge tournaments for, because Warhammer has a high blood price. There's a reason why I didn't do a big Let's Play how to play for this one. I want to build new armies for this. That takes a long time. Building a Warhammer army for Old World, if you're going to do it like properly and enjoy it and paint models that you care about and that you like, it's going to take a minute. It's going to take some time. So that's what I plan on doing. I'm going to, yeah, paint the models I like, take my time doing it, play some escalation games, like I did with Legions Imperialis. So check out the rest of the videos today for the army that you're excited about, where we're going to go through the Arcane Journals and the Forces books. There'll be a whole big playlist of them, but you can go up here in the cards and check them out. Thanks for watching. We'll see you for more GMG reviews. Thanks for workshops sending this along early for me to check it out. Till then, I'm Ash.